Good morning, everyone. And welcome to the 2017 Annual News Conference of the Caribbean Development Bank. We are very delighted to have you here with us today. To members of media joining us here in Barbados, to those of you joining us for the live stream around the region and across the world, to members of the management and staff of CDB, welcome. Today we are pleased to have with us our president, Dr. William Warren Smith, who you will hear from very shortly. He's joined by Dr. Justin Ram, our Director of Economics, who will follow Dr. Smith's statement with a presentation. After, as usual, we will open the floor for questions. And if you're watching online, remember to tweet those questions to @CaribBank using the hashtag CaribDev. And now, ladies and gentlemen, President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Dr. William Warren Smith.
Thank you very much, Swan. Members of the media, members of the management and staff of the Caribbean Development Bank, good morning and welcome to our annual news conference. As usual, I'm pleased to see the sizable and diverse representation from the regional journalism community here today. In case you haven't noticed, in recent years, we have been stepping up our engagement with the media. Our aim is to increase public awareness and understanding of the work of the Caribbean Development Bank and its role in helping Caribbean countries to respond appropriately to key development challenges and opportunities. This morning, I will share with you what we consider to be some of the highlights of CDB's performance in 2016. I will also make some very general comments about the region's socio-economic situation, setting the stage for my colleague, Dr. Justin Ram, who is our Director of Economics, to give more in-depth assessments of the challenges which we face as a region and CDB's prognosis of the economic performance of Caribbean countries for the medium to long term. Let us now turn to the highlights of CDB's operations last year. First, we reached noteworthy milestones in deepening our strategic partnerships and successfully mobilizing financial resources that all borrowing member countries can use to craft appropriate responses to their development challenges. Financial resource mobilization on terms which are more favorable than those which our countries could achieve on their own is a key mandate for the Caribbean Development Bank. Sometimes our publics aren't aware of this critical role which we play. I'm very pleased with the progress of the United Kingdom Caribbean Infrastructure Fund Partnership Fund, UK-CIF as we call it, which became fully operational in 2016. Last year, we approved $16.4 million for road rehabilitation in Antigua and Barbuda from this fund. Technical assistance grants were also approved for the preparation of the road rehabilitation project in Antigua and Barbuda, and for one also in Dominica. Ladies and gentlemen, funding was approved as well for a feasibility study for coastal highway upgrading in Belize, for bridge rehab in Dominica, and for water supply improvement in Grenada. Let me also mention the £35 million Essex Valley Agriculture Development Project, which is currently being considered for funding under the UK-CIF program. Ladies and gentlemen, this innovative project will increase irrigable land under production and will increase the use of solar energy to ensure that water flowing from the irrigation wells will be affordable for the small farmer beneficiaries. Indeed, consistent with the overarching objective of the UK CIF, this project can catalyze the transformation of agriculture in Jamaica from subsistence farming into an internationally competitive sector capable of improving the lives of farmers in Essex Valley, South St. Elizabeth. As we told you last year, we're giving high priority to redressing the fallout from climate change. This is an inescapable reality, and we have made it our business to put in place the financial resources which are necessary to redress the effects of sea level rise and more dangerous hurricanes. We have also tapped new funding for renewable energy and for energy efficiency. For example, and for the first time, the CDB accessed a $33 million credit facility from Agence Française de Développement to support sustainable infrastructure projects in select Caribbean countries, and a €3 million grant to finance feasibility studies for projects eligible for financing under this credit facility. At least 50% of those funds will be used for climate adaptation and for climate mitigation projects. We also persuaded the Government of Canada to provide financing for a $5 million Canadian support to the energy sector in the Caribbean Fund, a mouthful, which will be administered by the CDB. This money will help to build capacity in the energy sector over the period 2016 to 2019. No less significantly, ladies and gentlemen, in February, we also became an accredited partner institution of the Adaptation Fund. And in October 2016, after much hard work, we achieved the distinction of accreditation to the Green Climate Fund. Why is this such a big deal? The Caribbean is facing a climate crisis, which we need to tackle now with urgency. The Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund have opened new gateways to much-needed grant and other low-cost financing to address climate change vulnerabilities in all of our borrowing member countries. We closed last year with the successful completion of negotiations for the replenishment of our Special Development Fund, SDF as we call it, the bank's largest pool of concessionary resources. Our contributors agreed to a US $355 million program covering the period 2017 to 2020. Notably, the SDF interest rate, which for an extended period was pegged at 2 to 2.5% interest, was unified at 1% in an effort to strengthen the fund's overall competitiveness and in recognition of the financial and debt challenges that our countries have been facing. Very important development, ladies and gentlemen. With this ninth replenishment, CDB now has an additional $45 million to continue our work in Haiti. And we have a further $40 million for the highly poverty-focused Basic Needs Trust Fund program. In 2016, we approved 134 sub-projects totaling around $21 million under the BNTF program. That's no mean feat, and we're very proud of that accomplishment. Through this vehicle, we continue to make a big impact on community development and poverty reduction in our region, mainly through the increased emphasis on human resource development. The second highlight of 2016 is the bank's continuing enjoyment of a high credit rating in our capital markets, with both Standard & Poor's and Moody's confirming the ratings of AA and AA+, respectively. More on that anon, not in this media conference. Our strong business profile and very strong financial profile, according to Standard & Poor's rating methodology, paved the way for CDB to secure a borrowing of 150 million United States dollars on the Swiss capital market during the year. That was breaking new ground for us. We had never raised that type of money in the European markets before, and certainly not in that European market. This was part of a broader strategy to diversify the bank's investor base. And we were extremely pleased with the reception that we got from the investor group that we met with in 2 Swiss cities. And we were especially pleased at the response that we got. I think the order was filled in something like a few minutes. Just a good indication of how much they liked our paper. The third thing I'd like to say is that 2016 was a successful year for the bank's financing activities, as we surpassed our approval targets for both loans and grants. Total approvals, including US $45 million in grants, but excluding the approvals for the UK CIF, reached $306 million. This is compared with the $292 million we did in 2015 and the $270 million we did in 2014. So I want to take this opportunity to, as they say, big up the folks in the projects department under the leadership of Mr. Daniel Best and with the solid support of his Vice President, Mrs. Patricia McKenzie. Good job. I would also like to recognize the good work of Mr. Justin Ram, Dr. Justin Ram, who you're going to be starring here very shortly. Justin was vigorous out in the field, doing the work that is so necessary to enable us to accomplish our targets. So, ladies and gentlemen, 16 capital loans, 2 policy-based loans, and 84 technical assistance interventions were approved in 2016. Belize, St. Lucia, and Suriname were the 3 main beneficiaries of these new loans. The improved performance reflects in part the relatively strong demand coming from Suriname and is consistent with our diversification strategy to reduce portfolio concentration risk. Of special note is the approval of $15.3 million for the bank's first geothermal project under the new CDB GeoSmart initiative. If you want to hear more about GeoSmart, we can talk about it either in the break or in the question and answer period. If exploratory and production well drilling results are favorable and feasibility is demonstrated, this, ladies and gentlemen, could be the game changer for St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And it could significantly reduce that country's fossil fuel imports. It could increase its energy security and create opportunities for exporting electric energy down the road. We are excited by what this portends, since many countries in the OECS are similarly endowed with geothermal energy. We know that by making smart investments in sustainable energy sources, we can secure a better and more predictable future for the people of the Caribbean. Other notable projects financed in 2016, quickly. Bank resolution in Anguilla, very important. It helped to stave off a major banking crisis in that country and possibly a wider banking implications in the rest of the ECCU. Street lighting retrofitting in Antigua and Barbuda, in St. Kitts and Nevis, and in St. Lucia. Improved access to education, services and skills development in St. Lucia and in Guyana. Youth empowerment in Grenada. Water supply improvement in Dominica and St. Lucia. A line of credit for small and medium-sized businesses in Belize. And climate-resilient infrastructure and basic social services for poor and vulnerable communities in Belize. On the disbursement side, the bank also performed well. Total loan disbursements stood at year-end at $154.8 million. Ladies and gentlemen, we monitor disbursement performance very closely. Why? Until project beneficiaries are in receipt of such resources, CDB financing cannot have the desired development impact. And this has been an area of challenge for us and also for the borrowing member countries. So we're working very hard to improve our capacity in that area. What happened in this particular area in 2016 was that our staff focused their efforts to strengthen project supervision and also project portfolio performance. So we made good progress in this area in 2016, but this is one where we need to ramp up our efforts and do even better. At the core of our operations is the desire to better the lives of Caribbean people. That is the context within which we help to design, appraise, and evaluate every project that we finance. Turning quickly now from projects to macroeconomic outcomes, how did our region do in this critical area? I am encouraged by the knowledge that a few BMCs achieved economic growth rates in excess of 3% last year. My sense, though, is that overall, economic growth across our region remains somewhat uneven, and that fragile recovery, especially in the larger borrowing member countries, will continue into 2017. The big challenge for each and every one of us then is to reverse this pattern and place the BMCs firmly on a path of sustained and inclusive income growth with discernible improvements in living standards. But in order to realize this goal, all of our countries must be earning sufficient foreign exchange to pay for the goods we import for both consumption and for production. Once we all can make that direct connection between our living standards, our imports, and our foreign exchange earnings, then we can better begin to appreciate what I regard as the two most pressing policy imperatives for our region. What are they? First, our governments must offer services that promote efficiency and cost competitiveness, whilst fostering inclusive growth and protecting vulnerable groups in our society. That latter point about vulnerable groups you will hear repeatedly from the Caribbean Development Bank. For much of our history, Caribbean countries have depended on a very narrow source of foreign exchange earnings, largely because we find it difficult to compete in global markets in areas where comparative advantage is not defined by natural endowments. The fastest growing Caribbean countries today are those which offer services like tourism that have been expanding in line with global recovery. On the other hand, commodity producers have been set back by the headwinds of falling commodity prices. Unlike more diversified small states such as Mauritius and Singapore, which have weathered recent global shocks well, Caribbean economies continue to exhibit the volatility that has kept average growth rates low, unemployment and poverty high, and living standards stagnant. The second imperative is that government activities must be financed by revenue systems that meet the sufficiency criterion, while promoting equity and economic efficiency. Regional fiscal performance is, however, caught in a vicious cycle. Because economic growth rates are so low, many governments are unable to generate the primary balances needed to correct adverse debt dynamics, so public debt remains unsustainably high. Emergency revenue measures implemented to stem fiscal deterioration following the global recession have had a perverse impact on competitiveness, thereby further constraining economic growth. Government services are not being delivered in a cost-effective manner. Social safety nets are still not being adequately targeted. Institutional and regulatory reforms for improved private sector competitiveness are lagging behind the rest of the world, and state-owned enterprises are not adhering to universally accepted financial management practices. So how do we turn this around? Dr. Justin Ram will examine the key policy options for addressing these challenges when he makes his assessment of the current situation in our region this morning. So let me just end with 3 final points. First, regional governments which have begun to take corrective measures and implement adjustment programs are to be applauded for their efforts. But there is still a lot of work to be done, ladies and gentlemen, and the risk of policy reversal or abandonment is very high. We're not out of the woods yet. Now more than ever, regional governments cannot become distracted and relax their resolve to stay what might appear to be a painful course. Instead, they must become even more vigilant. Their commitment to doing the right thing will help to build confidence and ultimately stimulate private interest in growth-enhancing investments. Second, CDB is sensitive to the difficulties that policymakers face when introducing major reforms, especially because of the social fallout that could result if the process is improperly managed. This is why there's growing acceptance that adequate social safety nets must be an indispensable part of fiscal and debt adjustment programs in order to minimize the negative public backlash and the risk of waning commitment. I encourage policymakers to work with the development partners, including us here at the CDB, to facilitate the implementation of their adjustment programs. My final point is that at CDB, we will also continue to work on improving our portfolio performance. We've been doing a reasonably good job, in my judgment, mobilizing attractively priced resources that can assist with the economic transformation and the sustainable development of our region. We will be stepping up our engagement to improve the ability of every borrowing member country to access and utilize these resources effectively. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you for your attention, and I now turn over to the chair.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. At this time, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome our Director of Economics, Dr. Justin Ram, who will deliver his presentation on the 2016 Economic Review and an outlook for 2017. Justin.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good morning all, journalists, colleagues, members of the audience, including those who are online. My presentation will begin by looking at the global picture, followed by an overview of regional economic performance. I will end by sharing our vision for the Caribbean economy and some policy prescriptions to help us get there, emphasizing why, as a region, we need to take urgent action now. First, the global picture. 2016 proved to be a difficult year for economies around the world. Advanced economies' output growth decelerated, while emerging markets stagnated, and the Latin America and Caribbean region declined. Collectively, this amounted to a slight deceleration in global growth. However, modest acceleration in global output is expected in 2017. The uptick in global growth is expected to be supported by a return to positive growth in Latin America and the Caribbean, following a marginal decline in 2016, as well as strengthening of economic activity in the rest of the world. The way forward for the global economy is marked by some profound risks, however. Global outlook is shaped by subdued recovery and weak trade. The pace of economic growth is expected to increase in the US, but with risk due to uncertain policy environment and a bull market that is now long in the tooth. China is also rebalancing, and the full impact of Brexit is still not known. But there are some opportunities as well. Continued low levels of commodity prices, albeit with a mild recovery in recent months, and advancement in artificial intelligence could improve productivity and lead to the creation of new industries. Prospects for emerging markets are expected to strengthen as several economies currently in recession, namely Brazil and Russia, are expected to recover gradually. Let me now turn to the regional picture, where we are and where we are going. Most of CDB's borrowing member countries' economies grew in 2016, but there were contractions also. The mainly service-oriented economies of the bank's BMCs recorded positive growth in 2016, while the predominant commodity exporters, except Guyana, I should add, contracted. Belize recorded a modest decline, while significant contractions were recorded in Trinidad and Tobago, where that economy declined by 5%, and in Suriname, which declined by a further 9%. Average growth across the region, therefore, was negative 0.9%, compared with 0.4% growth in 2015. So our purpose as a development bank is summed up in the words of CDB's first president, Sir Arthur Lewis, when he opined that the conditions under which people live should be our mantra. So with unemployment remaining unfortunately high in most countries, we are forced to ask ourselves some serious questions, namely, what is the cause of this high unemployment? High unemployment continues to be a challenge for most countries in the region, and even in those countries with comparably low unemployment rates. The notion of underemployment is also a consideration. The unemployment outturn for 2016 was mixed across the BMCs, with most countries for which data is available showing declines. In particular, unemployment declined markedly in St. Lucia due to increased construction sector activity. But at 20%, it is still too high. In Trinidad and Tobago, the trend is heading in the wrong direction. In addition to what is reflected on the slide here, we must recognize a high unemployment among the youths in the region, with rates close to 30% and higher. This perhaps explains the uptick in crime in some of our borrowing member countries. Employment of women also lagged that of men, leading to higher levels of poverty amongst female-headed households. So we must begin to ask ourselves some fundamental questions about our social and economic progress. Growth is consistently lower than in other small island developing states. Even as the region recorded positive growth in past years, it continued to lag behind other small states. It might be necessary for us to find out what some of these states are doing right, since small size alone does not seem to be a constraint to growth. Our BMC economies are either commodity-based or service-oriented, specifically tourism. Analysis shows us that commodity prices are still relatively low, and the pace of growth in visitor arrivals has decelerated. Despite the recent uptick in crude oil and natural gas prices following the OPEC decision in November to cut supply, these prices are still relatively low by recent standards. The price of gold has also recorded a steady decline in recent months. In the case of tourist arrivals, assuming observed growth rates persisted through to the end of the year, then we expect 8.3 million overnight visitors to have visited our board member countries in 2016. This is an increase of about 1.7% over the 2015 levels. However, this compares poorly with the 4% increase we saw in 2015 and the 5.9% increase we saw in 2014. In addition to this, the ability to do business has deteriorated in most board member countries. Doing business in the region continues to be plagued by our economy's lack of competitiveness, and with the exception of Guyana, which moved up 16 places to 124 in the World Bank 2017 Global Doing Business ranking, all other territories lost ground. Guyana benefited from reforms particularly related to the advancement of the use of its credit bureau. However, and I should say however here, an aggressive and ownership-driven reform agenda puts Jamaica as consistently the best regional performer in the Doing Business ranking, notwithstanding the slight fallback in ranking in 2017 relative to its ranking in 2016. Overall, the region's ranking fell 3 places to 120 in 2017. There is a correlation between adverse doing business conditions and weak economic performances, which ultimately leads to a cocktail of fiscal pressures and high debt. The region continues to be characterized as an area of low economic growth and high public debt. More than half of the BMCs are saddled with debt ratios in excess of 60% of gross domestic product, the level at which debt becomes a drag on growth. Looking at the comparable data between 2015 and 2016, only 5 territories were able to reduce their debt burdens. Antigua and Barbuda reduced by 5.5%, Grenada 5.1%, Jamaica 4.5%, St. Kitts and Nevis 3.5%, and Guyana 2.2%. Importantly, these countries all recorded positive growth, and all but one had primary fiscal surpluses in 2016. All other territories recorded an increase in their debt ratios of varying degrees. The economic cocktail also extended to foreign currency reserves, which were below benchmark levels in some BMCs in 2016. These declined year on year to less than the equivalent value of the global benchmark of 3 months of imports, for example, in Barbados. There were improvements in the Bahamas and Suriname, but reserves remained below the 3 months threshold in these countries as well. In other territories, foreign exchange reserves remained above the threshold through the year-on-year changes were mixed. Trinidad and Tobago, despite its challenges with foreign currency and circulation locally, continues to have the largest stock of foreign exchange reserves. Looking forward to full year 2017 growth, the region is projected to record positive growth across the board this year. So this is good news. Growth among BMCs is expected to average 1.7% in 2017, better than the outturn in 2016, but well below other small island developing states, and well below where it needs to be to stimulate employment and reduce the persistently high debt levels that we see. Growth is expected to be driven by increased tourism activities and construction activities, mainly related to the tourism industry. The Caribbean Tourism Organization is forecasting that tourism arrivals will increase by between 2.5% and 3.5% in 2017. Slightly higher commodity prices are expected to incentivize increased production in those industries, but the higher prices are not expected to be sufficiently high enough to derail growth prospects in the non-commodity producers. Given this backdrop, it's important that we have a vision. Where do we need to be, and how do we get there? Ladies and gentlemen, we need to act now. Where we need to be is on a higher consistent growth trajectory that is inclusive and which unfolds in a safe, crime-free environment for all citizens. This must also be done in a way that is environmentally sensitive, provides buffers to the possible effects of climate change, and which prepares our young people for the demands of the new labour market, including skills that will be complementary to automation and artificial intelligence. How we get there requires an action plan with an all-hands-on-deck approach. Our region needs an action plan which better enables it to participate in global supply chains and increase labour demand, and targeted social development assistance. But policymakers must be prepared to set the right environment to tackle the obstacles to growth. That is to say, the doing business environment, including access to financing for micro, small and medium-sized enterprises, and labour market reforms, which all of this could increase productivity and enhance competitiveness. In this endeavour, it would be necessary to reform governance structures and institutions to support the new paradigm. Governments will have to be willing to stabilize their economies through fiscal and debt consolidation and to develop strong targeted social development programs. This reform agenda begins with the notion that inclusive growth is an imperative. As the region navigates a challenging global economic environment, it is important to work together, and by the same token, the benefits of positive growth outcomes should be enjoyed by all. This can be done through targeting the Sustainable Development Goals. The chart here, which is an extract from Carnival in Mexico, depicts how public policies could be used to improve the lives of the less fortunate among us, to move them to higher levels of standard of living. We therefore need social development policies such as quality education and good housing, and institutions that can target where support is required. Our social development agencies must also have the capacity to continuously evaluate and improve their performance to help achieve the desired outcomes. Secondly, in order to break the unhappy cycle of high debt and low growth, economic stability is a precondition. Fiscal discipline is crucial to restoring and supporting economic stability, and this would require some consideration for fiscal reforms in both expenditure and on the revenue side. In addition to the implementation of reform policies, BMCs would also need to implement targeted technical assistance programs for MSMEs in sectors that have potential to contribute significantly to economic development and employment. The academic literature is replete with evidence that a high debt burden compromises a country's economic stability, its economic growth agenda, and government's ability to support social programs. With that in mind, proper institutions and frameworks to manage debt, identify risks, and craft mitigating measures are all important. And given the vulnerabilities to natural disasters and how this has contributed to debt accumulation, it is important for countries to use revenue windfalls to set up contingency funds or sovereign wealth funds to reduce the debt burden and ensure greater economic and social resilience. Let me now turn to growth-enhancing reforms. In order to place macroeconomic performance on a higher plane, there are some structural reforms which can be easily undertaken immediately to enhance inclusive growth. Focus should be on growth-enhancing structural reforms that help businesses to grow, that reduce barriers to trade and strengthen the financial sector. Such reforms should also follow or allow for increased use of public-private partnerships, or PPPs, through divestment to help unlock value from underutilized state assets. They should facilitate and promote green energy production, provide incentives for raising capital, for example, on the junior stock exchange markets, and foster access to global supply chains. Efforts should also be made to engage the region's vast diaspora in this growth agenda. As I conclude, it is important to note that a significant platform for consistent positive growth outcomes is good governance, as our President mentioned before me. It is therefore an imperative for the region to move forward with a good governance agenda. A well-functioning governance system can effect change through predictable, open, and enlightened policy making, a bureaucracy imbued with a professional ethos, an executive arm of government accountable for its actions, and a strong civil society participating in public affairs, and all behaving under the rule of law. Systems of government should be transparent, foster inclusion, security, and growth. Moreover, government operations and resources should be managed in such a way to ensure good value for money. So the vision and action plan must be one of shared prosperity. Prosperity that is sustainable, with renewed institutions and greater reliance on the private sector for economic growth. Ladies and gentlemen, we know that action changes things. And as a region, we must therefore act now. I thank you very much. I hand you back over to Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Justin. At this time, we're going to open the floor for questions. As you prepare to ask your questions, please remember to state your name and the news outlet that you're representing. If you're joining us online as a journalist, remember to tweet those questions to @Carabank using the hashtag CaribDev. And we'll also try and get some of those questions to the panel for response. Gentlemen? Stetson?
Stetson Bob Stockholm Network.
Use the mic, please.
Is it on? Right. Okay, fantastic. Stetson Bob Stockholm Network. Gentlemen, against the background of what you've said, the context, can you speak to specifically the Barbados situation, high fiscal deficit, high debt, the printing of money to finance that deficit, and the currency peg? Can you speak to those, excuse me?
Sure. The Barbados situation is one where there are extreme challenges in the Barbadian economy now. We have seen that there's a situation now where foreign exchange reserves are below the 3-month threshold of import cover. The fiscal deficit is at a level that is currently unsustainable, and also debt levels are high. So what does Barbados need to do now? Barbados, of course, as Dr. Smith mentioned and I mentioned in my presentation, we need to start thinking about how we can improve the overall competitiveness of this economy. But at the same time, while we are doing that, we need to think about how we stabilize the macroeconomic fundamentals. So there are a number of areas where I think policymakers can look at to try to stabilize the fiscal situation here. 3 areas come to mind. When you look at the expenditure of the government of Barbados, transfers and subsidies currently account for about 13.9% of gross domestic product. Wages and salaries about 8.5%, but interest payments on debt accounts for whopping 7.5%. So there are areas here where the government of Barbados could perhaps look at to consolidate, to perhaps look at reducing expenditure and bringing that into line. But in addition to that, while, as our President continuously says, changing the wheels while the bus moves, we have to also look at how we can enhance growth in the Barbados economy. A debt to GDP ratio is determined by 2 things. There's a denominator and there's a numerator. So we really have to also examine how we can improve the growth prospects for Barbados. And here I believe there are a number of areas that we can look at to enhance the overall competitiveness of the Barbados economy, to ensure that growth is returned to this economy once and for all, on a sustainable path.
Please go ahead.
My name is Alirio Polsbroek. I'm from Suriname, and I have a question for Mr. Warren Smith. if he would like to answer that for me, please. Mr. Smith, in 2013, when Suriname became a member of the CDB, you said, and I like to quote you then, Suriname has a sound economy which is growing rapidly. Now we know things have changed, but we've also noticed that in the past year, 2016, the CDB have come in and helped Suriname a lot. So I guess that you still see prosperity somewhere in the future. Can you tell me now, in 2017, what are the expectations of the CDB on Suriname's economy?
Thank you very much, sir. Words, oh words. Oh, they come back to haunt you, eh? Yes, thanks very much for the question. There is no doubt that when Suriname became a member of the Caribbean Development Bank, they were enjoying a sweet spot as far as their growth prospects were concerned and the actual growth numbers that they were achieving. That's a reality. I think what the Suriname situation illustrates for us in this region is our vulnerability. The volatility to which our economies are subjected, in part because of a point that we made in our presentations. First of all, the narrow economic base of our countries, the heavy reliance on a very small number of foreign exchange earning sectors. In the case of Suriname, there was excessive reliance on the gold sector, so that in excess of 90% of Suriname's revenues were coming from that sector. So that when gold went into decline, the prices that is, the fortunes of Suriname rapidly changed. So that I think the logic of it is that Suriname needs to do what so many of our other economies need to do. They need to broaden the economic base. And to broaden that economic base, they need to carry out a number of reforms. Those reforms would include some of the things that Dr. Ram mentioned in his presentation, which is creating that business environment within which the private sector would want to start to introduce new industries in what is a country that is extremely well endowed. So that what we at the Caribbean Development Bank would say to the situation now is that we're not there for a country in the good times only. We're there to assist our countries also when they experience difficulties. And that is precisely what we are doing now. We have provided, along with the other multilateral institutions, financial assistance to Suriname through a number of projects. We did one, I think the first loan that we provided to Suriname was in the technical and vocational education area, which is very, very critical for the diversification of the economy. And then on the onset of the crisis, Dr. Ram and his team went in, along with the IDB and some other, and the IMF, and they looked at the situation, they made an assessment of it, and they designed what we call a policy-based loan, which was targeted at addressing reforms which were key to the development and transformation of the economy. The other thing that we have done is that we have recognized that no country can make real progress unless they have a sound energy sector. In the case of Suriname, there's a lot of work that needs to be done in strengthening the electricity sector, so that we went in this past year and we provided a very large loan, very large for a small institution like the Caribbean Development Bank. I think the figure was somewhere in the order of $64 million. And that loan is to help to strengthen the infrastructure, the electricity infrastructure in Suriname. We intend to remain engaged with Suriname. We are not going to impose policy. We're not going to impose solutions on that country. We work with your country. but we also feel that part of our responsibility is to provide advice, because we have the privilege of working with a large number of countries so that we can learn, we can draw experience from the successes and the failures of policy in other countries. So that is how we plan to engage with Suriname, but we intend to be there through thick and thin.
Good morning, Dashan Hendricks from Radio Jamaica. I often hear from people in your shoes, both of you, telling countries in the Caribbean to broaden the economic base. But broaden it to what? We're not in a static world. We're in a dynamic world where we're not the only ones looking to broaden our base. So, what are the competitive industries, from your perspective, you're seeing where the Caribbean, in general, can broaden to the benefit of each individual countries and to foster the growth that we all need to see to improve our standard of living?
Thank you for that question. What we have been advocating for, first of all, is that our economies and policymakers need to stabilize our economies. So get us on firm macroeconomic footing. That means having fiscal accounts that are close to balance, or certainly having primary balances that are near in positive territory. But in addition to that, what we are advocating for is that we need to look at the doing business environment, so that entrepreneurs in each of our economies can therefore see for themselves where opportunities lie, and to take advantage of what we're saying are global supply chains. We are not necessarily advocating that one industry is better than the other. But what we're saying is that if the doing business environment is correct, and that it's easy for anyone to get into private activity, so that it doesn't take very long, for example, to start a business, or that it doesn't take long to pay your taxes, or that the regulatory burden is not too burdensome, then our entrepreneurs within our Caribbean economies can then see where there is potential and decide for themselves what industries they would like to pursue. So that's the first thing. However, there are, of course, some burgeoning industries that we see now in the Caribbean that are taking a foothold. Certainly the creative industry, where we're seeing a number of young entrepreneurs taking advantage of the opportunities that are available globally. And we're actually seeing supply chains being developed across the Caribbean. So, for example, we're seeing entrepreneurs in Jamaica taking up opportunities in the US, but at the same time, subcontracting some of that work to entrepreneurs in the rest of the Caribbean, including as far south as in Trinidad and Tobago. So there are real opportunities. In addition to that, there are also a lot of other opportunities for us to improve the current industries and improve the efficiency of some of the industries that we currently now have. So take, for example, the tourism sector. Many of us might think that with the opening up of the Cuban market, that there are specific threats to the tourism product in the Caribbean. We are saying no. There are certainly opportunities there for us to capitalize on that. So that when tourists go to Cuba, if we have the direct air links from Cuba to the rest of the Caribbean, we could also see visitors that go to Cuba directly, then coming to our markets here. In addition to that, as I said before, the global supply chain can be very wide. We're seeing, for example, opportunities in port infrastructure. For example, with the opening up of the Panama Canal, the widening of that canal, you're seeing even larger ships coming through that canal. And so there are opportunities there as well for Caribbean countries to now tap into even more global supply chains than were available before.
And if you would just permit me, because the questions online are pouring in and I don't want to miss the opportunity to share them with the panel. We have a question from Antigua Observer, Alicia George. And the question is, Antigua and Barbuda recorded some growth in 2016. What is the prospect for growth in that country for 2017?
Okay. Thank you. Yes, Antigua and Barbuda did record growth in 2016, and we are expecting growth in 2014 to be around 4% in 2017. Now, there are, however, some challenges that the Antiguan economy faces. Much of that growth for this year will be dependent on the construction activity that's likely to take place in the tourism sector. In addition to that, we also expect to see large increases in government construction activity with respect to the refurbishment of roads, for example. However, when we look at the government's fiscal accounts, there needs to be some consolidation there to ensure that debt levels do not spiral into levels where we think there can be debt distress. So there are a number of risks associated with our growth prospects for Antigua in 2017. And so we would actually say to the Antiguan authorities that while you do have growth, positive growth in Antigua for 2017, and we did have growth in 2016, there needs to be some consideration for some fiscal consolidation this year.
Great, thank you, Justin. The answer?
Good morning, Deanza Roberts, What's Up Caribbean and Loop News Barbados. I have two questions. At your 45th AGM, you spoke of a proposed study that was aimed at cutting regional youth unemployment, if you have an update on that. And also in terms of St. Vincent, we know that a survey in 2010 by the World Bank survey did say that one of the main obstacles of doing business in that country was electricity cost, and they have since obtained a loan or grant from you for that project. Have any other member countries approached you on the whole aspect of geothermal energy and project for funding?
Well, maybe I could take the second question and ask Dr. Ram to take the first. As far as the electricity sector is concerned, for geothermal, we have been in discussion with a number of our countries. The geothermal activity in those countries, there are different stages of development. As far as St. Vincent and the Grenadines is concerned, what we have done is to put together a financing package which would address the exploration phase of that country's geothermal development. Assuming that the results of that exploration exercise, if those results are positive, meaning that there is adequate steam emanating from the wells that are being drilled, then we could move to the next stage. So the intention of CDB is to look to support through the financing package that we have developed, which we refer to as GeoSmart. The idea would be to support the development of that resource to the production stage, ultimately. In the other countries, we continue to be in dialogue with them, and our expectation is that the financing package that we have will be attractive enough to enable us to be in the game once they have reached the stage for that sort of discussion.
On your first question, we did complete that study. That study was completed in 2015 on youth unemployment, and it can be found on our website. We'll be happy to share that link with you. That study was very well received, and it actually contained a number of recommendations for policymakers on how to tackle this huge problem that we have within our economies and high levels of youth unemployment. One of those really relates to the skills mismatch between what many of our young people are leaving secondary school, the skills that they're leaving secondary schools with, and the actual demands of the labor market. And so we'd be happy to share that report with you after.
Paul McAdam from Gina, Guyana. We had a change in government 2 years ago, almost 2 years ago. economically things have slowed a bit. Well, last year, the finance minister did admit that. Do you think that we're still on the right path in terms of fiscal responsibility, in terms of growth? It's still continuing. Do you think that the policies that are being put in place are set to put us on the right track economically?
When we look at the prospects for the Guyanese economy, the Guyanese economy, the future I think is quite bright for Guyana. Recently, as you know, there have been large discoveries of oil offshore. I believe that also includes natural gas as well. And we expect the oil from those wells to probably start flowing in about 5 years' time. So let's say maybe in the early 2020s. So that Guyana, I think there's a great potential there. With respect to government financing, we do think that the government is correct in being fiscally prudent and being very careful in how it manages its debt to GDP ratio, which, as you saw from my presentation, actually declined in 2016. So that's actually good. So the government has continued to consolidate fiscally. But we do also recognize that Guyana also has some other challenges. Social, but there are also infrastructural challenges, which the government would now have to consider how it would go about financing those financing gaps or those infrastructure gaps that the economy now faces. There are a number of ways to do that, perhaps without increasing the debt burden significantly. We have spoken about the need for our governments to look at public-private partnerships. But let me just also make the point as well that whenever our borrowing member country governments decide to borrow for, let's say, projects, infrastructure projects, it's also very important that the returns on those projects should exceed the interest rates on those loans. So overall, it's important that our governments spend money wisely and get great value for that money so that the rate of return on those projects actually provide economic benefits to all of its citizens. So in short, I would say that Guyana is actually very well poised to take advantage of the recent resources that it has discovered. And I think that if those resources are managed properly, then Guyana could actually be one of the most diversified economies of our borrowing member countries. So I think it's actually on the right track.
Thank you, Justin. We have one question in the final row.
Yes, Marlon Madden, Barbados Today. I have two questions actually. I want to find out from the CDB, did Barbados approach you last year for any loans? And if you have any suggestions and or recommendations for us in terms of water and sewage management, given the issues we've been having lately?
Yes, we have continued to provide Barbados with financing in the area of capital loans, and we have provided loans in the water sector. What I'd like to do is to ask for some detail, if you're interested in detail, from our operations staff. I don't know, Daniel, would you like to just give a quick summary of some of the more critical loans that we have provided to Barbados in the recent past?
Sure, thank you, Chris. As it relates to the water sector, we would have provided a loan in 2015 to the Barbados Water Authority. And we have been in discussions with them as recently as January to determine with the new management, as we know there's a new management in place at Barbados Water Authority, to determine how we can advance the implementation of the loan. Now the loan is to improve, to reduce non-revenue water, which continues to be one of the major challenges to the BWA, as well as improve the plant from the aging infrastructure of the Water Authority. So we're pleased to report that the procurement of engineering services under that initiative has commenced, and the consultants should be engaged before very early in the second quarter of this year. And we anticipate that civil works under this initiative will commence later this year. Also, as you would know, at the end of 2015, we would have approved a loan to the Student Revolving Loan Fund to look at improving the sustainability of the fund and doing a comprehensive institutional strengthening assessment of that institution. And we have been in discussions with the government of Barbados, and we anticipate that disbursement on the Student Revolving Loan Fund should occur again very early in the second quarter. So the dialogue between the CDB and Barbados, the various agencies within which we operate, has been ongoing. Thank you.
Just a quick follow-up, sorry. What's the value of the loan?
Yeah, so the loan to the Barbados Water Authority was approximately $35 million.
I see
And
we have...
7.5 million to the Student Revolving Loan Fund.
Thanks, Daniel. We have a follow-up question from Ian Bourne, Bajan reporter.
Yes, Daniel. I noticed you said non-revenue water. Would this be what Barbadians know as standpipes across the country?
No, not sorry, not entirely. This is water that essentially, for which the Barbados Water Authority receives no payment. So water that leaks essentially from pipes underground. And you're quite right, for many of our standpipes across the island, there is also significant leakage.
Thanks, Daniel. I believe we have a question from Belize.
Jules Vasquez from Channel 7 News. Sorry, Jules Vasquez from Channel 7 News in Belize. A few questions. Dr. Ram, last year's forecast had Belize at, I believe, 2% growth for 2016, or a little over 2%. And we see that the outturn for Belize is minus 1.2%. Are you able to speak about what accounts for the disparity between forecast or projected and real? And then also, would you all be able to speak about this widespread issue in the region, correspondent banking, and the attendant, all the attendant issues that arise from that, including a slowdown in the services sector?
Yes, so thank you for that question. So yes, our forecast for Belize earlier in 2016 was positive. However, a number of events occurred throughout the year. Number one of those, well, the effects of the hurricane as well provided some damper to overall growth prospects. In addition to that, there were disease effects in the agricultural sector, which also affected shrimp farming as well in Belize. So that meant that production in those particular sectors were much less than we were actually predicting. In addition to that, the government of Belize also had to intervene in two state-owned enterprises, as you would be aware. And that also had some negative effects on overall government expenditure, and has actually now led to a massive increase in government's overall debt burden. So these are areas that perhaps also need to be examined in 2017, and which we at the Caribbean Development Bank are actually in the process of going into Belize to assist them with. Let me also say something about the tourism industry, which has actually been keeping the Belizean economy afloat as of now. There's real potential there for that industry to take off, but what we find when we look at the data is that because of the peg of the dollar to the United States dollar and the overall strengthening of the US dollar, that has actually now had a negative impact on the overall competitiveness of the Belizean tourism sector, certainly for visitors who are visiting from other parts of the world. So overall, we think that going forward, while that industry provides significant potential for the Belizean economy, the Belizean authorities, working alongside with the private sector, need to examine how they could think about improving the overall competitiveness of that industry to ensure that its overall growth continues, and even beyond that, that its growth rate grows over the medium term.
Thanks, Justin. We've got a few waiting online. Oh, sorry.
Okay, just quickly on the correspondent banking issue. The issue has not gone away. It is still very much a major threat to our countries. I think that there's been a lot of good work done in trying to sensitize the region to the challenges from the correspondent banking crisis. There's been a lot of diplomatic work that has taken place, engaging with the host countries, for want of a better word, the countries where the correspondent banks are located, to try to get a better understanding of what are the issues that are leading to the crisis that our countries face. There have been several meetings which have been held in which an attempt has been made to analyze the problem in some depth and to try to identify solutions to those problems. I don't think that we're at the stage yet where I think we could honestly say that there is an end in sight to this crisis. But I think one thing that is certainly emerging is that where we could concentrate as a region is on trying to ensure that our environment, our banking environment, our financial environment is brought up to a standard where the risk of being blacklisted by the correspondent banks is minimized. And one of the things that we have advocated, and I think that we are quite prepared to provide assistance in this regard, financial assistance, is to have an entity like the Caribbean Financial Sector Task Force work with the jurisdictions, our country jurisdictions, to help them to identify weaknesses and mechanisms that they could deploy to strengthen the quality of their jurisdiction. So it's summary. We're still at risk. Some countries are at greater risk than others. Your country, Belize, is perhaps one of the most affected, and the need for a solution is urgent. But I'm pretty confident that at the end of the day, the matter is one that is tractable and that a solution will be found. We just need to keep giving it the attention that it deserves.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. We have time for 3 more questions. We'll take 4 more. And I'll take 1 online, 3 from in the room, and after we can follow up in one-on-ones. Sounds good? All right. So Jamaica, Love 101 FM. And their question is, what can the private sector do in Jamaica to play a greater role in propelling economic growth? And how can the government improve the growth prospects for Jamaica?
That's a mouthful. But I think that, as Justin indicated in his presentation and in some of his remarks recently, there are some good things that are beginning to emerge in the Jamaican environment, economic environment, which represent good opportunities for the private sector generally. One is the success that has been achieved in stabilizing the key macroeconomic fundamentals. I think that is very, very good news. The other piece of good news related to that is there seems to be continuity in policy in that regard as we have moved from one government to another. I think that one of the greatest opportunities that exists today within the Jamaican economy is to start to take advantage of the possibilities in the wider CARICOM region. For many years, Jamaica was a very, very poor performer as it relates to exports into CARICOM. And in my judgment, a lot of that had to do with the fact that the economic environment was not conducive to investment, the modernization of plant, especially industrial plant, and also for the improvement in the agricultural sector, so that Jamaica was not competitive in the rest of CARICOM. I think that there is evidence now that that transformation is beginning to take place. There are a number of enterprises that were not in the export business, either in CARICOM or elsewhere, and are now beginning to appear in the wider Caribbean economy. So that's a big opportunity. The final one that I will speak to is the opportunity that is associated with engaging with what is now a burgeoning tourist industry, so that there is opportunity in the agricultural sector to provide linkages to the hotel sector, and also for the development of more attractions, which are a key component of the diversification of the tourism sector. So there's opportunity for the cruise shipping passengers who are now coming into the country in much larger numbers, and also for those who are sitting in the all-inclusive hotels. The opportunity is there now to build more attractions which will enable those guests to spend more money in the local economy.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Trinidad.
Good morning, Nicola Barreto from Government Information Services in Trinidad and Tobago. Two questions. Dr. Ram, in your presentation this morning, you stated that the full impact of Brexit is not yet known. Is it that we are not, or I should say the region is not feeling the effects of Brexit as yet? And I know that you can't predict the future, but what do you expect may be the fallout of Brexit in 2017? My second question, the elephant in the room, the effects of climate change, which of course member states, the region, we need to pay closer attention to. How do you as CDB, how are you now going to engage the region, inclusive of the member countries, so that they can, I should say, can work together? Because of course the effects of climate change will affect all of us here in the region, mainly tourism.
Sure. Okay, so I will speak to the possible effects of Brexit. Well, I believe we're only a matter of weeks away from Article 50 being triggered in the United Kingdom. Although there was an intervention only this morning by a former Prime Minister about the way that Brexit should be implemented. But for us here in the Caribbean, the United Kingdom has been historically and continues to be a very strong trading partner for us, particularly with respect to our tourism industry. And even beyond that, with respect to foreign direct investment, in the case of Trinidad and Tobago in the oil and gas sector, as you know, British Petroleum is the largest player within that industry in Trinidad and Tobago. So Brexit provides some uncertainty for the British economy and for those operating in the economy. And so there's always going to be some uncertainty with respect to tourist arrivals from that country. Depending on how Brexit unfolds, we might expect to see a fall off initially in some tourist arrivals from the UK coming to the Caribbean, as you know, as people become uncertain about their own employment and so decide not to take vacations, which in many instances can be treated as something that might not be a necessity. In addition to that, I saw recently in Trinidad and Tobago that there are some concerns with respect to the overall levels of foreign direct investment that's likely to be triggered because of Brexit. The uncertainty surrounding that for British companies, and so what that means for them now investing abroad, we are yet to see. However, I think going beyond Brexit, we know that the United Kingdom government has actually articulated their desire to forge new trading partnerships around the world. So perhaps the Caribbean, and certainly many of our CARICOM and CDB board member countries, members of Commonwealth, there could be possibilities for us there to even forge even greater trade linkages than we even have now with the United Kingdom. So there certainly are risks in the short term, but overall I think in the medium term there are also opportunities for us to capitalize on?
In respect of the climate change issue, in my view, like so many other threatening events in life, climate change represents both opportunity and threat. I don't need to speak about the threat component of it because I think we pretty much understand what the implications are. Why do I say there's opportunity? Well, on the adaptation side, as far as the effects of climate change as it relates to natural hazards, the opportunity is for us to remake our economies, to retrofit our economies, if you will, to make them more resilient, so that all the infrastructure that we have in place, much of that infrastructure is at risk because of the risks associated with climate change. So that one of the opportunities we have, and it certainly is an opportunity for the Caribbean Development Bank, is that there's no money available that is nicely priced, that enables us to be able to provide a response to our countries which need to address the building of resilience, greater resilience in their infrastructure. I make mention of one particular source of financing that we have used, I think, quite effectively. This is a line of credit that we obtained from the European Investment Bank. It was about $60 million US, called the CALP Fund, the Climate Action Line of Credit. And we've pretty much committed all of those resources, and we're actually disbursing those resources as we speak. So this is an opportunity which we took advantage of. Those funds can be used both for renewable energy and energy efficiency, and they can also be used to retrofit infrastructure and to build infrastructure that's more resilient and in keeping with the requirements of this new and more dangerous world that we live in. I think one of the biggest risks that we face at the Caribbean Development Bank is having done the good work of putting the resources in place. I spoke this morning about the accreditation that we have had to the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund, is to ensure that an adequate pipeline of projects is there so that we can deploy these resources, because it is of little value to our countries if we have access to the resources but there are no projects to put them in. And that relates not only to the adaptation side, that is strengthening the infrastructure, but also to the great opportunities that exist now in relation to renewable energy. I made reference this morning to some projects we have financed in the area of street lighting. This for us is real low-hanging fruit. Provides an opportunity to improve the fiscal position of governments, because governments are the ones that generally pay for street lighting. It reduces the emission of noxious gases. I know Ms. Dixon wouldn't like me to put it so inelegantly, but I think you get my point. So there's real opportunity, and of course, the geothermal opportunity that I spoke to in relation to St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the other OECS countries which have geothermal energy potential.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
Good morning. I'm Garfield Burford, Antigua Barbuda Broadcasting Services. Two quick questions, one to Dr. Smith, one to Dr. Ram. To Dr. Smith, there seems to be a kind of contradictory policy in relation to, or contradictory prescription in relation to the multilateral agencies for SIDS, like in the Caribbean. On the one hand, the governments are being asked to cut their debt, to consolidate debt and their fiscal position, but on the other hand, they're being asked to put in place mechanisms to facilitate growth. And you mentioned that as a perverse prescription in your presentation, that on the one hand, there's this consolidation needed. Where do they find the resources from to put in place some of these reforms needed to get the growth, to create the enabling environment? That's one. To Dr. Ram, you mentioned that SIDS in the Caribbean face a challenge, that are not necessarily similar to other SIDS, so size is not an issue. Other SIDS are doing well. I think you mentioned the example of Mauritius. What other SIDS can you point to that are doing well that can be a model for the Caribbean?
Well, in relation to your first question, I don't think that there is necessarily a contradiction. One of the things that we are saying is, and Dr. Ram outlined it pretty well, I thought, is that you can't stay in a situation where you run large fiscal deficits indefinitely, because the consequence of that is going to be the accumulation of more debt, which puts you in a position where you ultimately become unsustainable. That debt becomes unsustainable with all of the negative consequences that flow from it. Dr. Ram mentioned that once you start to have this debt overhang, it becomes a drag on your ability to grow. So you need to do those things to get your fiscal right, okay? When you get your fiscal right, if you have to go to the market to borrow, you're going to borrow more cheaply than if you are in a situation where you have a very high and unsustainable debt situation. That's the first point. You will also be positioned to be able to attract resources from institutions like ourselves, which tend to lend at more attractive terms and conditions than you would get from going to the international market. So there's a real incentive to get the macroeconomic fundamentals right, because then you will be in a position to be able to get your debt trajectory in the right direction, and you will also be better positioned to be able to borrow funding, whether it be from the external markets or from the multilateral institutions, to be able to do the development work. But let me just finally say that the development of your country is not just a function of government expenditure. It is also a function of private investment. And I think this is another point that Dr. Ram mentioned. Private investment is very much dependent on the type of environment that you create for the private sector. That's part of the mantra that all of us are now emphasizing. You need to get that environment right, and then you'll start to see more and more investment, and it sort of becomes a sort of a virtuous circle. So I think that is, I hope I have managed to explain it. It's a little bit, sounds a little bit circular, but I think that's how we would view it. Dr. Ram?
Sure. With respect to comparator countries, so across the globe we certainly mentioned Mauritius and Singapore, which are two relatively small, open economies that have been doing fairly well compared to most of our board member countries. Now, although I have painted the entire Caribbean with a single brush, there are countries here in the Caribbean that are performing relatively well. For example, take Cayman Islands. That economy has performed well, and the growth rate was very good in 2016, and the prospects look even better for 2017. But when we dig deeper and we look at the fundamentals of a country like Cayman Islands, what can we see? The government has put in place strong fiscal accounts so that its debt to GDP ratio is very low. And as Dr. Smith just mentioned, it means that when the Cayman Islands has to go out and borrow on the market, it can attract very low interest rates for its capital expenditure program. Take, for example, some of our other board member countries that recently have been doing the right things. Grenada, for example, as we know, only a few years ago, had a very high debt to GDP ratio, in excess of 100%. And now, because of its fiscal consolidation that it has undertaken over the last 3 years, we are seeing growth return to that economy. So the government has been doing what? The government has been consolidating its fiscal accounts. There's also been a debt restructuring there, of course, but it has meant that the debt to GDP ratio has declined significantly. But in addition to that, the government has put in place the necessary doing business reforms to ensure that now the private sector has the correct incentives to invest in the Grenadian economy. So, for example, the education sector, led by the St. George's University there, has been doing very well and continues to attract many pupils and students from the United States and further afield. So, in effect, what we need to see in more of our borrowing member countries is a case of stabilize the macroeconomic environment, ensure that the fiscal accounts are actually stabilized, that the debt to GDP ratios are stable and not going in the wrong direction. This sends in itself the correct signal of incentive to the private sector that they can have certainty around fiscal policy and know where the tax, for example, the tax rates are going to go in the near term and over the medium term. And in addition to that, enhance the doing business environment so that investors now also have increased confidence to invest in the economy. And by doing so, you create jobs, greater employment, and therefore overall prosperity for our citizens.
Our final question from the first row. Thank you.
And thank you. Royal Titus, Grenada. Just segueing from what you mentioned in the Grenada experience, and the question is inviting you to comment, not necessarily on politics, but on political governance, because so far your comments have been on the economic rollouts, but invariably one may affect the other. Dr. Ram, in the Grenada experience, just to comment as well, a legislation has been passed, a law restricting spending in a given year to not more than 9% above GDP, right? As part of that rollout. But what you find, and I suppose that might be replicated across the region too, is that the constituents or social partners who would have called for responsibility, fiscal responsibility, we need to have fiscal responsibility in government, and that's all the rhetoric. And then when it comes, then if it affects them, they sort of oppose it. So the same thing they will call for, when it comes into play, they will oppose it. Now that's politics. So my question to you is, what are the political challenges? Because you mentioned policy makers, which in my view is a code word for political governance. What are the political challenges that you see there in the region that affects the proper economic adjustments that we need to make?
Well, you're correct. In Grenada, they have instituted what we call a fiscal rule, which limits the amount that government can spend after trying to bring the overall budget into balance, and so therefore trying to achieve a sustainable debt to GDP ratio of 60%, I believe, by, I'm not entirely, can't remember the date, but it might be about 2025 to 2030. That, we think, is very responsible, and it's a good way for governments to ensure that their fiscal accounts are in balance and that you have good value for money. Throughout our presentations this morning, we made reference to the fact that we do understand that there are other considerations with respect to development that are beyond just the balancing of the fiscal accounts. We also understand that there needs to be a strong social programs so that all members of society can benefit from what we are terming inclusive growth. So that what we have been advocating for, and certainly this is across the region, that there really needs to be a floor on social expenditure. But more than that, governments must not spend their social budgets in a blanket way. They must be targeted to those who require it. What we're saying is that over time, if the government targets its expenditure in the correct way, then individuals who are less fortunate than most of us in society will be able to improve their skills, let's say, their educational skills, and thereby over time move out of, let's say, the poverty trap that they currently could be in. It means that over time, because the government has targeted its social expenditure sufficiently well today, that over time you're going to see more and more people get into the labor market and start to fend for themselves. But in addition to this, and again we make the point here that it is really important for us to see the private sector as the engine of growth. Governments must really be providing the enabling environment, the regulatory environment, that supports efficient use of private sector capital so that that can be the driver of growth, so that more and more people can be employed in greater private sector sectors and in companies. So we think that that's the way we need to move towards. I think fiscal rules are extremely good, but there needs to be strong targeted social expenditures, and we also need to ensure that the private sector becomes the engine of growth in all of our economies.
If I could just intervene a little bit on the political aspect that you mentioned, and I assure you I'm not getting into the specific politics of either Grenada or any of the countries that are represented here. But I think you made an important point about when countries engage in reform. Reform sometimes is painful. Choices have to be made. Difficult decisions have to be made. And therefore, there is the real possibility, in fact, there is the likelihood of resistance to reform. But I think your country is a very good example of the kind of inclusive way in which policy should be implemented. And I don't remember what is the term that your Prime Minister has used to characterize it, but it is a process of engagement with the public where, there are, I guess, town hall meetings would be a good term. There's opportunity presented for people at the grassroots level to hear the government officials speak to the reforms that are being carried out, talk about the implications of those reforms, and the people get an opportunity to let the government of the day and the officials who are involved in the reforms to hear from the horse's mouth how they are feeling about it. And I think that is a very good way in which to engage, and a good way in which to carry out painful reforms which are so necessary sometimes in our small countries.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I know I said that question was our final question, but we're now going to have our final question from the gentleman in the third row.
Andrew Worrell, Trinidad Guardian. Looking at the data that was presented by Dr. Ram, I'm seeing that the ease of doing business is declining. Tourist arrivals are declining. Commodity prices are still flat. And the region as a whole has below benchmark foreign exchange reserves. The data is also suggesting that we expect growth across the region in 2017. So I'm wondering how are these two things working together when they seem to be opposed? On what is the prediction for growth in 2017 based?
Sure. So in 2017, yes, we are predicting that the region will grow on aggregate by 1.7%. Now, some of our economies are performing better than others. Many of the UK overseas territories, we expect to see very strong growth there. But we're also expected to see growth return to the Trinidad and Tobago economy, which accounts for about 1/3 of the Caribbean regional economy across our board member countries. So remember that in 2016, the Trinidad and Tobago economy contracted by about 5% overall. And so that had a drag on overall regional growth prospects. With the return to growth within that economy, and I think we're projecting about a 1% growth for 2017, that means that will provide an overall boost to the regional economy. Now, you are correct. There's still a lot of room for us and a lot of areas for us to improve. The doing business environment needs to improve in most of our countries, and so we are hoping that this year we can make concerted effort to assist our board member countries in tackling some of these niggling doing business reforms. But I should point out that there are only some of our countries that have foreign exchange reserves that are less than the 3-month threshold. Most of our countries actually do have foreign exchange reserves that are above that 3-month threshold. Of course, there's always risk that some can fall below. But we see that there's an opportunity for better prospects for increased foreign exchange revenues this year, because we think that this year we're going to see an improvement in the performance of the advanced economies. Certainly we expect the U.S. economy to continue its uptick in growth there. And as you know, many of our visitors to the region come from the United States. We also expect to see an improvement in the European market as well, and we expect to see more visitors from Europe visiting our shores here in the Caribbean. So that's also going to provide a huge boost to our tourism sector. But in addition to that, because of that incentive and that forecast that we're going to see more and more tourist arrivals, we're seeing renewed efforts with respect to construction, in particular in the tourist industry. So this is also an area whereby we expect to see renewed growth coming from in 2017.
Thank you, Dr. Ram. And that's all for questions today. Whether you joined us here in the room or online, we want to thank you for being part of our 2017 Annual News Conference. We'll see you next year. Thank you.